So, after a hard-fought battle, the raw data was finally made available. Researchers, journalists, and advocates from all over the world rushed to reanalyze the data and find out what really went on in the PACE trial. And what they discovered was that the PACE trial was littered with red flags and filled to the brim with some of the worst science anyone has ever seen. Pretty much everything that you shouldn't do when conducting medical research, it's in this paper. You can find it all. So what we're going to do now is go through a numbered list of all of the highly questionable things that went down in this trial. Number 1. The day before the raw data was released to Matthews, the paper's authors reiterated that the PACE trial was a randomized control trial, but as was found by its independent review, there was actually no blinding, no masking, and no placebo control group involved. This means that it was actually an unblinded trial. So, unlike in, for example, a drug trial where participants and people delivering the drug typically don't know if it's the real thing or a placebo, every patient involved in the PACE trial knew exactly what kind of treatment they were receiving. It was built into the nature of its design. Every group knew exactly what they were getting. And the one thing you are not supposed to do with an unblinded trial is to rely on subjective measures for determining the outcome. But that's exactly what they did. They relied on things like questionnaires handed out to participants. But if you were a participant in the PACE trial, you would have been fully aware that you were partaking in treatments that were supposedly helping you. And so, if you were given the questionnaire asking all about how much those treatments you received helped you, it's very likely that your responses would be biased because you were already expecting them to help. Number 2, running an unblinded trial that relies on subjective measures is bad enough, but in addition to that, something that you are never in a million years supposed to do under those circumstances is try to influence your participants' subjective views on the outcome. So tell me why, halfway through the study, did participants receive a newsletter from the team running the trials in which there were glowing testimonials from previous subjects talking about how much the treatments had helped them? Why is it that in this newsletter there was an article stating that GET and CBT were, quote, based on the best available evidence, recommended to treat the illness by the UK's newly released clinical guidelines? Why did this newsletter also fail to mention the fact that a key PACE investigator also served on the UK government committee that endorsed those two therapies? Why the hell did they even send participants a newsletter halfway through the study anyways? It's so fucking weird. Number 3. The PACE trial's claims of success relied almost solely on subjective outcomes, but that's not because the researchers didn't also take objective measures. They did. They did 6-minute walk tests, step tests, and they looked at data on unemployment status and who was in receipt of disability benefits. And they found that none of these measurements provided any evidence to support their claims of successful treatments. In fact, in the review of the trial, they found that, quote, the number of patients claiming state sick pay and disability benefits increased, and the number of patients in receipt of income protection or private pensions had actually doubled. So instead of taking these really significant findings into account, the researchers abandoned all of the objective measures except for the 6-minute walk test and dismissed them as non-objective, irrelevant, or unreliable. All of these really concerning findings essentially just went out the window. Number 4. The results of the 6-minute walk test were statistically significant, but not clinically significant. Could the participants walk further in 6 minutes than they could before the trial started? Technically, yes. Were they also walking a distance that you would expect a patient waiting for a lung transplant to be attaining when performing this test? Also, yes. Number 5. Nearly a quarter of the CBT participants and nearly a third of the GET participants couldn't even complete the 6-minute walk test, most likely because they weren't able to. And I'm pretty sure those patients just weren't counted in the final tally when they were measuring the average distance covered. Catherine Kane, the patient I quoted in the beginning of this video, makes such a good point and paints such a hilarious picture when she writes about this aspect of the PACE trial in her article. She points out that at some point during this trial, there was a scientist standing around holding a clipboard who watched patient after patient barely cover any ground during this 6-minute walk test or just outright fail to complete it. Truly, they must have been witness to some of the poorest results ever gleaned from a 6-minute walk test. And then afterwards, they turned around and they were like, well, it looks like we're really onto something here. These treatments are working just as well as we were hoping. In fact, roughly 1/5 of these patients are completely cured. Like, someone was there and they genuinely thought that these results were good enough. Number 6. In order to qualify to participate in the PACE trial, patients had to score 65 or less on the SF36 physical functioning scale, but in the PACE trial, a score of 60 or more on that same scale equated to recovery, which meant that some participants were simultaneously ill enough to participate and well enough to have recovered before the trial even began. There is so much more that I could say. This is really only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to this trial, but if we went through everything that's wrong with it, we would be here all day. I'd like to move on for now because the time has come to reveal our two mystery authors and the mystery co-funder. Have you been able to guess who they are? If you guessed Peter White and Michael Sharp for the two mystery authors, then you would be correct. Congratulations, your prize is the loss of faith in your fellow human being. Peter White was actually the head of the PACE trial, so it was in many ways his creation. I can only imagine he is thrilled to know that its name is inextricably and forever tied to his own. And what about the mystery co-funder? We know already that the UK's Medical Research Council spends only 0.02% of its yearly budget on ME research, and that ME research in general rarely gets funded, so someone must have coughed up a lot of money to get this trial running. It cost £5 million, remember? So whose name is on the trial paper under the heading funding? It's none other than the United Kingdom government's Department of Work and Pensions. When I first found out that the PACE trial was funded by the DWP, my reaction was sadly that I can believe it. I've been let down by my own government before, but then I paused for a second and I thought, it's kind of odd that out of all the branches of the UK government, the DWP would be funding a medical trial of all things. You would think that if any department of the UK government were going to spend money on medical research, it would be one that deals more with things like health or social care, something like the Department of Health and Social Care. So I looked up what other medical research the DWP has funded, and the answer is none. As far as I can tell, they have not partially or fully funded any other medical research before or since, which begs the question, why? Well, I don't know how much I can say. I can feel a government-trained sniper's scope on my back as I speak, but hypothetically, it would be really, really convenient for a government that's trying to cut its welfare spending if one of the most common and devastating chronic illnesses in existence could be treated and even cured by using such simple, cheap measures. You wouldn't even have to pay out for additional biomedical research. Anyways, completely unrelated to anything that we've spoken about so far, the last thing we're going to do is read out the conflict of interest listed on the paper. Peter White has done voluntary and paid consultancy work for the UK Departments of Health and Work and Pensions and Swiss Re, a reinsurance company. DLC has received royalties from Wiley. JB was on the guidance development for the National Institute of Health and Clinical Excellence Guidelines for chronic fatigue syndrome and myalgic encephalomyelitis, and has undertaken paid work for the insurance industry. GM has received royalties from Karnak. TC has done consultancy work for the insurance companies and has received royalties from Sheldon Press and Constable and Robinson. MB has received royalties from Constable and Robinson. MS has done voluntary and paid consultancy work for government and for legal and insurance companies and has received royalties from Oxford University Press. And then it seems like no one else has any conflicts of interest to declare. By the way, the PACE trial claims to be in accordance with the Declaration of Helsinki, which requires study participants to be adequately informed about researchers' conflicts of interest and institutional affiliations, and the researchers just straight up didn't do that. Like, they did not give that information to prospective trial subjects, so... and also, the PACE trial is still up. It is still up in the Lancet. It has not been taken down. So you can go look at it too. Don't just take my word for it. My mind is clouded with brain fog, and I've done my best, but I will openly admit that there may have been information that I've misunderstood or missed out. So please, I strongly encourage you to investigate this for yourself. Like, you can just Google it. Like, it's up there. Anyone can see it. Fact, I've shared quite a few resources in the description of this video where you too can learn all about the PACE trial.